The monastery bells were still ringing when the longships appeared on the horizon. Sister Ethelflaed stood in the scriptorium of Lindisfarne, her hands stained with ink from copying manuscripts, watching dark sails cut through the morning mist like knives through silk. It was June 8th, 793, and the world she knew was about to end. The other nuns had already fled to the chapel, believing God would protect them behind stone walls and wooden doors. Ethelflaed knew better. She had heard the traders' stories, whispers of what happened when the Northmen came. Prayer wouldn't save them. Nothing would. The first axe struck the monastery gate before the bells stopped ringing. Wood splintered. Iron screamed against iron. Then came the voices, guttural, foreign, filled with a terrible joy that made her blood freeze. The Vikings had come not just for gold and silver, but for something the church had tried desperately to hide in the centuries since. The systematic seizure of Christian women for purposes that would haunt the historical record, like a ghost no one dared name. If you're drawn to the brutal truths hidden beneath romanticised Viking sagas, and what really happened when Norse raiders encountered Christian communities, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more accounts buried in church records, archaeological evidence, and the few testimonies that survived the burning. Now back to the story. The Vikings didn't attack randomly. They planned their raids with meticulous precision, studying coastal settlements, learning which monasteries held wealth, which towns had poor defences, and crucially, which communities had populations worth taking. Women of childbearing age were valuable cargo, worth more alive than the silver candlesticks melted down for trade. But Christian women, especially those from religious communities, held particular significance in Viking culture that historians only began to understand when DNA evidence forced them to reconsider centuries of sanitized narratives. Inside the monastery, the nuns huddled in the chapel as promised. 23 women ranging from 14 to 60 years old, praying in Latin as the doors shattered inward. The Vikings entered with torches and weapons, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, cataloguing everything they saw. They killed the elderly abbess immediately, too old for their purposes, too likely to cause trouble. Her body fell across the altar she had served for 40 years, blood mixing with holy water, in a pool that reflected torchlight like dying stars. The younger women were dragged outside into the courtyard, where smoke from burning buildings already darkened the sky. Ethelflaed felt rough hands on her arms, heard her veil being torn away, saw her sister nuns subjected to the same violent inspection. The raiders spoke in Old Norse, laughing, pointing, arguing over distribution. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was hideously clear. They were being divided like livestock, assessed for value, claimed as property. A warrior with silver arm rings and intricate braids grabbed Ethelflaed's chin, turning her face toward the light. He was looking at her teeth, checking for disease or weakness. She tried to pull away, and he struck her. Not hard enough to damage, but enough to establish dominance. Another warrior objected, gesturing at his own ship. They were negotiating. She was valuable enough to argue over. This scene repeated itself across Britain and Ireland throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records over 200 Viking raids between 793 and 1066, but its terse Latin phrases, "the heathens came," "much slaughter," "captives taken," concealed the human cost. Later historians, uncomfortable with the implications, focused on stolen treasures and burned buildings. The captive women became footnotes, if they were mentioned at all, but the evidence was always there, buried in unexpected places. Genetic studies conducted in Iceland between 2000 and 2018 revealed that while 80% of Icelandic male lineage traced to Scandinavia, nearly 65% of female lineage traced to Ireland and Scotland. Those percentages represented thousands of women forcibly taken from Christian communities and transported to Viking settlements. Each DNA marker was a life destroyed, a family shattered, a woman erased from her own history and inserted into someone else's. The journey from Lindisfarne to the Viking ships was less than 2 miles, but it marked the boundary between everything Ethelflaed had been and everything she would become. The nuns were bound at the wrists with rough rope and marched to the beach where longships waited in the shallows. She counted 11 ships, each capable of carrying 40 warriors plus cargo. The cargo today included silver from the monastery treasury, illuminated manuscripts torn from their bindings for the gold leaf, and 19 captured women. They were forced into the hull of the lead ship, pressed together in darkness that smelled of salt, fish, and old blood. As the ship launched, Ethelflaed heard Sister Hild begin praying in Latin. A Viking warrior silenced her with a blow that sent blood spattering across the wooden planks. After that, no one prayed aloud. They prayed in silence, or perhaps they stopped praying altogether. The voyage to Norway took 9 days. The women were given water and dried fish, enough to survive but nothing more. At night, warriors would descend into the hold and select women at random. The chosen ones would be dragged up to the deck. What happened there became clear from the sounds that drifted down, sounds that Sister Ethelflaed tried desperately not to hear, not to understand, not to remember. On the 4th night, they came for her. She was pulled from the hold by the same silver-ringed warrior who had claimed her at Lindisfarne. On deck, under stars she had once thought beautiful, she learned what capture truly meant. The violation wasn't frenzied or passionate. It was methodical, transactional, an assertion of ownership as casual as breaking bread. When it was over, he pushed her toward the hold entrance and returned to his rowing bench, already forgetting her face. This was the reality that church chroniclers couldn't write explicitly, and that later historians chose to minimise. Viking raids weren't just about wealth, they were about women. Saga literature hints at this constantly. The Laxdæla saga mentions Irish thralls with refined features. The Landnámabók, Iceland's book of settlements, lists dozens of founding families with Irish or Scottish concubines. The word used was ambat, female slave, but the clinical term concealed layers of violence. When the ships finally reached the Norwegian coast, Ethelflaed saw a landscape of impossible beauty, fjords cutting deep into mountains, waterfalls cascading from heights that seemed to touch heaven, forests so dense they swallowed the horizon. It should have been paradise. Instead, it was the gateway to a hell disguised as settlement. The captive women were taken to a trading post called Kaupang, a major Viking market on the Oslo fjord. Here, the mechanics of human trafficking became brutally visible. The women were displayed in a wooden enclosure while traders examined them, discussed their qualities, negotiated prices. Ethelflaed watched as Sister Hild, only 16 years old, was sold to a Danish merchant for 3 ounces of silver. She never saw her again. The silver-ringed warrior who had claimed Ethelflaed didn't sell her. Instead, he brought her to his farmstead in the interior, a large compound of wooden buildings surrounded by fields where thralls worked under the watchful eyes of overseers. This would be her new home, though home was too gentle a word for what it became. She was given to the household women first, the warrior's wife and daughters, who stripped away her torn nun's habit and dressed her in a thrall's tunic. Rough wool dyed a dull brown. They cut her hair short, a mark of slave status. Then they explained her duties through gestures and broken attempts at her language. Cooking, cleaning, fieldwork, weaving. And whenever the master desired, serving him in ways that made her former vows of chastity feel like cruel mockery. The system was well established by the time Ethelflaed arrived. Viking society had refined the integration of foreign captives into a precise hierarchy. Christian women occupied a strange middle ground, more valuable than common thralls because of their literacy and refinement, but forever marked as outsiders by their faith and foreign origin. They were useful for producing children who could be raised as Norse, diluting their Christian heritage until it disappeared entirely. Archaeological evidence from Viking-age settlements reveals the scale of this practice. A burial site at Flakstad, Norway, excavated in 2017, contained the remains of a woman with isotope markers indicating she had grown up in the British Isles but died in Norway. Her grave goods included Christian symbols alongside Norse artifacts, a physical manifestation of forced cultural blending. She was one of hundreds, possibly thousands, buried in Scandinavian soil, far from their birthplaces. Ethelflaed bore her first child within a year of capture. A son with his father's blue eyes and her dark hair, a living reminder of violation transformed into dynasty. The child was taken from her at weaning and raised by the warrior's wife as a proper Norse child. He was taught to worship Odin and Thor, to see Christianity as a weak foreign religion, to understand that his mother was property rather than parent. By age 5, he called her thrall instead of recognising their connection. She bore 3 more children over the following years, Each was absorbed into the Norse family structure, given Scandinavian names, taught to despise the faith that had once defined their mother's existence. The warrior's wife was not cruel about this. She simply operated within a system that had perfected the erasure of maternal bonds for the sake of cultural assimilation. In her worldview, she was raising these children properly, saving them from their mother's foreign weakness. Other captive Christian women on the farmstead followed similar patterns. Ethelflaed recognised one, a woman from an Irish monastery who had been captured 2 years before Lindisfarne. She had forgotten how to pray in Latin. She wore a Thor's hammer amulet alongside a small wooden cross hidden beneath her tunic. She had survived by adapting, by becoming Norse enough to avoid punishment, while clinging to fragments of her former identity in secret. At night, in the thrall quarters, the women who still remembered Christianity would whisper prayers in darkness, never loud enough to attract attention, never in the old formal Latin that might be recognised, but in the common tongues of their homelands mixed with the Norse words they'd been forced to learn. These hybrid prayers became their own form of resistance, neither fully Christian nor fully pagan, but something new born from trauma and survival. The historical record largely ignored these women until modern archaeology forced acknowledgement. Viking Age historian Judith Jesch noted in her groundbreaking 1991 study that the genetic evidence cannot be explained by peaceful intermarriage alone. The phrase was academic politeness for a darker truth. Thousands of Christian women had been forcibly transported to Scandinavia, where their descendants still live today, carrying DNA that testifies to ancestral violence. Irish annals provide some of the few contemporary accounts. The Annals of Ulster for the year 821 records. The heathens carried off a great number of women into captivity. In 836, a most cruel devastation of all the lands of Connaught by the heathens, and they carried off many prisoners. In 847, Mael Sechnaill plundered the territories of the heathens and liberated many from captivity. These terse entries represented thousands of individual tragedies, each woman at Ethelflaed with her own story of capture, violation, and forced assimilation. The practice wasn't limited to Britain and Ireland. Slavic women from the east, Frankish women from the continent, even Moorish women from the Mediterranean. All appeared in Viking settlements, their origins traceable through genetic markers, burial customs, and the few artifacts that survived. The Vikings had created an extensive network of human trafficking that operated alongside their legitimate trade routes, exploiting the chaos of the early medieval period. Some women found ways to carve out dignity within the system. A few became valuable as teachers, instructing Norse children in reading and writing, skills that became increasingly important as Vikings converted to Christianity and needed literate administrators. One Irish woman, mentioned in the Landnámabók as Melkorka, was captured as a princess, enslaved for years, but eventually revealed her noble heritage and secured better treatment for herself and her son. Her story was exceptional enough to be recorded, which suggests how rare such outcomes were. Most women simply disappeared into the historical silence. They bore children, raised them as Norse, worked until their bodies gave out, and died in foreign soil without markers or memory. When archaeologists excavate Viking Age farms and find female skeletons with foreign isotope signatures, they're finding women like Ethelflaed, women whose names were forgotten, whose stories were erased, whose DNA is the only testament to their existence. Ethelflaed lived until she was 41, an unusually long life for a thrall. The warrior who captured her had died in a raid years earlier, and she had been inherited by his eldest son, her own child's half-brother. The farm had converted to Christianity by then, following King Olaf's edict, but the conversion was superficial. The old practices continued under new religious vocabulary. When she died in the winter of 832, she was buried in a simple grave at the edge of the farmstead cemetery, separate from the family plot but close enough to be included in the Christian burial ground. Someone, perhaps one of the other former captives, placed a small wooden cross in her hands. It was discovered during excavations in 1987, carbon dated to the early 9th century, chemically analysed and found to contain oak species native to Northumbria. That cross was her voice across 12 centuries, proof that she had existed, that she had maintained some fragment of faith despite everything. The archaeological report described her remains clinically. Female, 35, 45 years old at death, evidence of multiple pregnancies, healed fractures consistent with physical labour, isotope analysis indicates British origin, burial includes Christian symbolism. Behind that dry scientific language was a woman who had been Sister Ethelflaed of Lindisfarne, who had spent her youth copying scripture, who had believed God would protect her, who had learned the hardest truth of all, that history is written by the victors, and the victors rarely care about the women they have destroyed. The DNA evidence that finally forced historians to confront this reality emerged from studies that weren't even looking for it. Researchers studying Icelandic genetic diversity for medical purposes discovered the massive discrepancy between male and female lineages. Similar patterns appeared in Norwegian coastal settlements, in the Orkney Islands, in parts of Scotland where Viking influence was strongest. Everywhere Vikings had settled, the genetic signature told the same story: Scandinavian men, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon women. For decades, scholars tried to explain this through peaceful scenarios: intermarriage, voluntary migration, cultural exchange. But the numbers didn't support those theories. You don't get 65% foreign female ancestry through willing partnerships. You get it through systematic capture, transport and forced reproduction across multiple generations. Modern Icelandic women carry the mitochondrial DNA of Irish and Scottish women who were taken between 800 and 1000 CE. That genetic inheritance represents approximately 20,000 to 30,000 captured women based on population modelling. Each one had a name, a family, a life before the longships came. Each one endured what Ethelflaed endured. Each one has been reduced to a percentage in a genetic study, a footnote in a history book, a fragment of bone in an archaeological report. The church tried to suppress these stories for its own reasons. Acknowledging the scale of Viking predation on Christian communities meant acknowledging the church's inability to protect its own. Better to focus on martyred saints and heroic resistance than on the thousands of women who were captured and assimilated. When later Christian Vikings wrote their own histories, they sanitized their ancestors' actions, transforming raids into heroic adventures and captive women into willing brides. The sagas perpetuated this revision. When they mentioned foreign women at all, they described them as prizes freely given or willingly married. The Orkney saga mentions Scottish women as if they had simply appeared in Orkney households through magic rather than violence. The Egil saga includes Irish thralls, but treats their enslavement as natural and unremarkable. The violence that brought these women north was erased, replaced with romantic narratives of Viking prowess and foreign beauty. Only in the past few decades have historians begun to honestly confront what the evidence reveals. Books like Neil Price's The Children of Ash and Elm and Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir's Valkyrie acknowledge the systematic sexual violence that accompanied Viking expansion. Archaeological journals now regularly publish studies of foreign women in Viking graves, each report a small step toward recognition. But recognition isn't justice. The women themselves remain voiceless. We know they existed through science, not through their own words. Unlike male captives who sometimes escaped and wrote accounts, unlike monks who documented raids from behind monastery walls, the captured women left no testimony. They couldn't write their stories because they were too busy surviving them. If you've heard this story tonight, understand that it's reconstructed from fragments, genetic markers, isotope signatures, burial goods, demographic patterns, and the silences in historical texts. Between the dry academic language and the romanticised saga literature lies the truth, that for 2.5 centuries, Vikings systematically captured Christian women, transported them to Scandinavia, and forced them to bear children who would be raised as Norse. It was cultural genocide through reproductive control, and it worked so well that the victims' descendants don't even know their ancestors' names. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt reading about what they endured. And if you want more stories that both Vikings and Christians chose to forget, subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with us. Because some truths only emerge when we stop believing the myths and start listening to what the bones have been trying to tell us for 1,000 years.